Welcome to class. Today we are going to talk about the relationship between language and culture. Right? Uh, the relationship between language and culture is intertwined. They have a symbiotic relationship, interdependent relationship. The issue of the influence of language on culture or the influence of or impact of culture on language has been long debated, and it is a long tradition of debate and counter arguments in favor and against of it. Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf's idea, and then French Boas' idea for that matter. It has got a long tradition, right? John Gumpers for that matter, right? All these people have contributed a lot in understanding the relationship between language and culture. The anthropologist like Tyler is very vocal about this debate. Then a series of anthropologists, a number of anthropologists uh, have been contributing to this debate. So today we'll talk about the relationship between language and culture. Now, language and culture are intertwined and they both influence each other. Culture influences language and language influences culture, encodes culture, right? When we say culture for that matter, or if you look at the growth and the birth, growth and development of human civilization, uh, you know, the day we started interacting, sharing, right, the culture was born. And the culture was born because we started interacting and sharing. So it's very difficult to establish which is superior, which came first, which is important, which is influential, because they grow hand in hand. The growth in culture has led to changes in language, right? And excessive interaction, sharing, and socialization develop the culture. So it's very difficult to take a single position. We have to see language and culture in totality and how they are intertwined. What kind of symbiotic relationship do they share, right? And when we say different culture, different language, different culture, the difference in language in terms of vocabulary, sentences, utterances, structures and words, usages are not merely differences of linguistic items, but also they represent a different value system. Represent a different cultural norm. They represent a different belief system, customs, right? Traditions, conventions, practices. So we can say that language is socio-culturally rooted. It grows like an organism in the fertile land of social and you know socio-cultural land. It grows like an organism. Uh, so values, fundamental assumptions, social behavior, attitude, communicative patterns of a group constitutes a distinct culture of that group. So we cannot outrightly, reject the idea that we know as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Culture, they talk about language and culture. They talk about linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. The language may not determine our cognitive abilities, but definitely language and culture do share a common ground. They are interdependent and the influence goes in both directions. So, language does influence culture and culture does influence language. So, that is the relationship between language and culture. Look at English for that matter. English is spoken in United States, English is spoken in UK, English is spoken in Canada, Australia, Caribbean islands, in India, huge majority, right? Now, language is the same, but do we have the same cultural orientation of the language all over? These cultures are different, but we all use the same language. So, difference in language. Do we have different in grammar rules of English? But there are certain cultural items, there are certain cultural components which are specific to Indian variety of English. We call it Indian English, right? Because there is certain element of Indianness, certain elements of Indianness are attached, right? Certain elements of American society attached to American English, the spelling systems for that matter, or choice of words for the similar object, bonnet versus dicky, bonnet versus hood for that matter, lift versus elevator for that matter. So, objective realities remain the same, but choice of expressions change, right? Norms of use change, norms of socialization changes, right? The context of use changes. So, with the change of culture, we find change of language. With the change of language, we also record and register difference of culture. So, language and culture are intertwined, they have a symbiotic relationship, they are inseparable, and it gets accentuated and underlined when we talk about second or third language learning. We will come to that in a while. Moving on, Kroeber says, culture started when speech was available, and from that beginning, the enrichment of either one led to the other to develop further. So, they are interdependent, right? Culture is the consequence of interaction and act of communication is their cultural manifestations or assertion. If you look at Tyler, he says, culture is in a complex definition includes beliefs, arts, skills, moralities, laws, tradition, and behaviors that an individual as a member of a society gets from his own society. Now, let us look at this act of acquisition of language. When we acquire a language, we acquire a language in a socio-cultural context, in a linguistically rich environment as a human child. When we say acquisition of language, what actually are we referring to? Are we referring only to structures, vocabulary, grammatical rules, or does that acquisition process also include the manner and the context in which these are used? So, what Chomsky says, linguistic competence, and countered by Delham's as communicative competence. So, we not only acquire rules of grammar, we not only acquire vocabulary, spelling and pronunciation, but we also acquire the manner and the context in which they are used. So, the functional properties of language are equally important, and the formal properties of language are not alone important. So, when we say I know the language, we do understand that we are talking about the formal properties of language, knowledge of formal properties of language, at the same time knowledge of functional aspects of the language, the use of it. So, structure and its use. And the use of language is strictly socio-culturally determined. I will simply quote a few statements from various scholars who have contributed to this idea, understanding. One is Edward Sapir, and it says, every cultural pattern and every single act of social behavior involves communication in either an explicit or implicit sense. So, if you go to Kroeber's idea, culture started when speech was available, right? So, when we say culture, it is a composite collective idea. Language inherits our shared history. Language encodes our shared history, shared culture, shared belief system, shared practices, shared norms. So, when a child acquires a language in a social environment, and child becomes member of that particular group by subscribing to the patterns of communication of that group, the conventions of that group, cultural practices of that group. So, we become individual, at the same time part of that collective identity. If you look at Crystal, he says language is a systematic conventional use of sound, signs or written symbols in a human society for communication and self-expression. So, for all cultural performances and representations, we require language. Referring to Saussure, his writings, right? If words stood for pre-existing concepts, they would all have exact equivalents in meaning from one language to the next, but it is not true. The concept of a sound, image or symbol in different languages is different. I unquote. Right? So, if you look at the sound, image, so the signifier versus signified, the objective reality remains the same for all languages, but the expression changes, right. So, if you look at the way language encodes culture, what is cultural knowledge? That we receive and we get, we learn through oral instructions and close observation in a particular group, a shared knowledge about the culture. So, a human child is born, it is a biological fact. So, the biological reality of birth of a child remains the same across cultures, across languages. But the way he or she becomes individual, it happens in a particular socio-cultural context. And these cultural norms are taught, given to the child through oral instructions in the presence of adults, practicing adults around. So, child inherits cultural knowledge through close observations and oral instructions, do's and don'ts. I mean, you recall your own childhood, the way you are today, the person you are today. You are the product of a consistent, structured and instruction, cultural instructions that you received all around, right? About the traditions, the conventions, the values, the morality, what to speak, what not to speak, when to speak, who is supposed to speak, what should be the genre of speech, right? How to disagree, how to agree, how to greet, how to socialize, how to meet. All these skills we acquire, all the knowledge of such things we acquire within a culture, right? Uh, our whole social behavior, our manner, the patterns of our socialization, our association to a cultural group, a social group, our subscriptions to group norms, ethnocentrism, all our expressions that we learn, we understand them, we practice them only because we have shared understanding, shared meaning. We understand about social hierarchy, our role, our social roles that we play, the distribution of power, status, position, So all these things we learn, and all these things together composite way create culture, and all these things we learn in terms of learning linguistic instructions, understanding linguistic instructions through language. All these are inherited and transferred through language. All such knowledge are transferred through language. So, we not only acquire language, but we also acquire the knowledge of culture and the ability to use linguistic expressions and structures in a particular socio-cultural context. So that's how our learning is complete, that's how our acquisition of language is complete, because language encodes culture. And when we say linguistic structures, we are also referring to the function of it, and the function of a structures is purely cultural and social. So this learning takes place in both ways. This becomes very prominent when you look at bilinguals. With the choice of language, with the choice of code, the speech patterns changes, the communication pattern changes. Right? People who are multilingual, we have same language like English, but different cultures and different representations in that language, assertions in that language. Right? So an infant, a newly born baby is exposed to language in the rich environment, but the newly born baby is also exposed to a series of cultural elements all around, and this understanding, this acquisition of language along with the functional properties of language take place together, right? They are not separate. Children are brought up within a social group and they learn the dialect or variety and communication patterns of that group along with the rest of the subcultural and behavioral traits and attitudes that characterize that group, right? And that is why it's important to emphasize on learning cultural context, specifically in a structured classroom teaching of second language. When you learn English, you not only learn English rules, grammar rules, vocabulary, pronunciation, spelling conventions, but you also learn about the English culture, about the English society through language, through literature. So, language and culture are very closely intertwined, and it becomes more visible when we look at the loss of language, because when you lose the language, what do you lose? Identity, the esteem, the pride. You lose the shared history. The difference between animal, other species in the animal kingdom and human being is that we have our history. We have our collective history. And how is it possible? If we have a knowledge of our collective history, it's possible because of language. If we have a shared culture and we are inheriting and transmitting it, transferring it to the next generation, it happens because of language, right? So when you lose the language, you lose everything. You lose your own identity, who you are, right? And the moment you lose identity, then your esteem, your pride. I mean, recall that famous Macaulay statement in his minutes of 1835. What he says, we want to create a class of Indians who are uh, Indian in bone and fleshes, but English in taste and morality. That's the power of language he is referring to, right? And look at the linguistic conflicts all around, the political conflicts all around. So these conflicts have some genesis in the, you know, some linguistic reasons. For example, creation of Bangladesh, a linguistic conflict. The linguistic conflict that started between Bangla and Urdu led to division of Pakistan, right? So it all started with linguistic conflict and that flared up to political conflict. Look at English only campaign in the United States, where a group of people demand that in order to have assimilation in the society, we need to have English only, uh, in the society, one language. However, United States has not declared any language as uh, official language. So when you lose a language, you lose identity, esteem, pride, your own shared history, the shared knowledge that language encodes, right? We lose the common binding factor of the group and the members, and we lose cultural knowledge because they are all encoded in language. A loss of language becomes almost like loss of culture. So finally, we do understand that language and culture are closely connected, intertwined, both influence each other, they have a symbiotic relationship. Language encodes culture, and language use is governed by socio-cultural norms, right? And culture is expressed and asserted in terms of linguistic expressions. That's the relationship between language and culture. We will talk about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or linguistic relativity as it is known popularly in our next class, and we'll see that even if you don't buy the strong version of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, language as a determinant of our cognitive capabilities, strong version, we do understand that we cannot outrightly reject that as well. So there is a degree of influence, and that direction is bidirectional. It is bidirectional. Both influence each other. And going by Krober's idea, culture happened because language was available, speech was available. So with this is it for now. Thank you. The cultural practices, cultural beliefs, social norms have a deep influence on linguistic structures. Look at the idea of politeness for that matter. Politeness is a cultural thing, culture specific thing. Look at the patterns of socialization in different cultures. Look at the patterns of association in different cultures. And when we try to translate those concepts in a different language. Translations offers us a deep insight into variation in culture and limitations of language in accommodating those variations. Because these differences are not linguistic only, they are cultural differences, and cultural items are very difficult to translate from one language to other. That is the relationship between language and culture, right? And the moment we start using another language like a bilingual, our entire communication pattern, our entire socialization pattern changes, right? We do not endorse the strong version of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that says that our worldviews are constrained by the language we speak or language determines our cognitive abilities. But at the same time, we cannot deny that language is influenced by culture. Look at the cultural items, for example, the food items, the rituals, the expressions for rituals, expressions for food, expressions for traditions, customs, mode of address, right? Socialization, intra-group socialization, intergroup socialization patterns. These are all expressed in terms of linguistic structures. So, that is the relationship, symbiotic relationship between language and culture. And these differences are seen when we look at the multilingual or bilingual societies very clearly, right. So, when we say loss of language, we talk about loss of a shared history, we understand loss of a shared culture. Those particular characteristics and distinct characteristics that characterize a particular group. If you look at the metaphors in the language, right, look at how language represents class, how language represents group, how language represents gender. So, you can find the connection between the two very clear, right. For example, sexism in language, right, that denotes the social attitude towards a particular gender, the collective attitude towards a particular gender, how it is in a subtle way expressed in linguistic structures, right. Look at the request, look at the demands, and look at these structures available. They follow the cultural norm, right. So, linguistic structures and social structures are intertwined. That is the relationship between language and culture, language and society. Social stratification of language was emphasized by William Lebov in his studies. How class influences the choice of uh, expressions, choice of words, sentences, stress. Right? His Martha Winner Island as well. So, study as well is equally prominent here. If you look at various studies carried out in social linguistics, they all underlined one fact, that language is a social reality, right. It is deeply rooted in socio-political context. It cannot be studied or it cannot be understood and learned as an object, right. So the influence between language and culture is bidirectional. Language influences culture, culture influences language. So, we'll talk about the relativity, cultural relativity, linguistic relativity in our next class when we talk about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This is it for now. Thank you very much.